Alright. Since our nation's birth in 1776, the United States of America has been one of the most nationalistic, patriotic, and prideful nations in the world. If you think about it, we have slogans such as, "These colors don't run," and "Don't tread on me," which are very patriotic. Further research indicates that the 4th of July is the second most marketable holiday in America next to Christmas, with sales in fireworks, patriotic attire like bro tanks, and American flag shorts I know Jared owns, seen it for a fact, and American flags reaching in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Americans carry this passion, this patriotism over to sports, namely the Olympics. But we don't care so much about the actual events in the Olympics as we care about the fact that America has won the medal count for the 8th time in a row. An example of this is the fact that none of us in the room can name who won the last marathon in the London Olympics. But all of us know that Michael Phelps won 8 medals in the Beijing Olympics to set a record. Now, I also believe that Americans, not maybe us specifically, but America in general, perceives war in the same manner. We don't necessarily care about the start to finish and all the events in between. We care about the fact that America won and that the other countries lost. And fortunately, we have won most of the wars that we fought in, with the exception of one, and that's the Vietnam War, which is arguably the most controversial war in our nation's history, where public support was at an all-time low, protests were at an all-time high, and the perception was that we were losing the war. In Beautiful Wreckage, W.D. Earhart, who also wrote the poem that Casey spoke about, W.D. Earhart questions whether these perceptions about the Vietnam War really affect the events that actually took place there, and comes to the conclusion, and wants us to come to the conclusion, that they in fact don't. Our perception does not change the fact that terrible things happened over there and that people had to go through those terrible things. And he further goes on to say that those people should be remembered. Now, if W.D. Earhart was some conscientious objector during the war and didn't ever go fight, he loses pretty much all of his authority and his reliability. But as Casey pointed out, he was not a conscientious objector. He served in Vietnam for 13 months with the U.S. Marine Corps. And while he was over there, he earned a Purple Heart, a Navy Combat Action Ribbon, and 2 presidential citations. So clearly he was in the thick of it, and he experienced what he's talking about in his poem, Beautiful Wreckage, firsthand. So from the opening stanza in the poem, Earhart discusses scenarios, but he poses them as questions. Examples of this are, what if I didn't shoot the old lady that was running away from our patrol? Or if the boy, but he wasn't holding a grenade? What if the lady in Hugh didn't have to lie in the rain, in a mortar pit, with 7 Marines just for food? Now, each one of those scenarios is terrible in their own right. But the last one struck me more than anything else in that poem, because I didn't really notice the significance of it the first time I read it through. It says a woman in hue. Most of us think of hue as a color, so like maybe it's a woman in a colorful dress or something. But in fact, if you read it, on my second read through, I realized that hue is capitalized, and further research shows that hue is was the 3rd largest city in South Vietnam during the war. And it was also the cultural and intellectual center of Vietnam. So it's an upper class area, very aristocratic. So the fact that this wealthy woman would have to reduce herself so low as to prostitution just to get food to survive is unfathomable. And he poses all these scenarios as questions because it helps the reader to subconsciously think about what their lives would have been like if that hadn't happened. What if I didn't shoot that old lady? Well, the reader now thinks, well, the old lady would have probably gone back to her village and lived a happy life and died peacefully. But that's not how it happened, because by asking what if, he's inferring that, in fact, that event did happen. He ends the poem in the final stanza with 4 questions. These questions are, what if none of it happened the way I said? Would it all be a lie? Would the wreckage become suddenly beautiful? Would the dead rise up and walk? And those last 2 are rhetorical questions. Obviously, the wreckage cannot be beautiful because wreckage and beautiful are polar opposites. They're antonyms. I looked it up. And obviously, the dead cannot rise up and walk because it's a biological fact that when you die, you lose all motor and brain function. So you would not be able to get up and start walking around. And he poses the first two questions to get readers to think about, does their perception of the war, does their perception of whether he told the story accurately, whether the war was good or bad, whether we won or lost, does that affect, or does that change the fact that, or does that make the wreckage beautiful? Does that allow the dead to rise up and walk? And the answer is no. So what Earhart's expressing here is that people's perception of the war doesn't change the fact that bad things happened. And the reason behind why he's writing about this is that people came back from the Vietnam War, and instead of being thanked or even recognized for their service, they were berated, harassed. No one really thanked them for anything they did because the protests were so high. So what Earhart's trying to point out is that their perception of what the war was isn't changing the fact that these people went through terrible scenarios and that these things should be remembered. So hopefully people that read Beautiful Wreckage in the future realize that we shouldn't treat war like we treat the Olympics, where all we care about is that America won and not all the events that took place, so that we can remember the people that went through those scenarios, remember the terrible times. Thank you.